He walked out carrying a cardboard box. Inside it, a framed photograph of a little girl, a tiny cactus with a hand-drawn smiley face on the pot, and nothing else. No severance letter. No goodbye. Just the quiet shuffle of dress shoes across polished marble and the sound of a door closing behind a man nobody thought twice about. That was the moment everything in that building changed forever. They just didn't know it yet. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss the stories that hit different, the ones that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's get into it, because what happened next inside that lobby is something none of those employees will ever forget for the rest of their lives. The elevator doors opened at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, and Mason Walker stepped out carrying the kind of box that means only one thing. It wasn't heavy. That was the part that got people. A man who had spent 3 years in that office, 3 years of early mornings and late afternoons, of lunch breaks eaten at his desk, and end-of-quarter reports filed without complaint. And everything he owned inside that place fit inside a medium-sized box from the supply room with the flaps folded inward. He didn't storm out. He didn't slam anything. He didn't make a scene the way some people do when they've been blindsided, when the humiliation and the anger and the disbelief all collide at once and come out sideways through a door that gets pushed too hard. Mason Walker walked to the elevator, pressed the lobby button, and stood with his back straight and his eyes forward while the doors slid shut. Downstairs, the lobby was its usual Tuesday self. The security desk had 2 guards, one scrolling his phone and one refilling a paper coffee cup. The revolving door pushed in a cold gust every time someone entered from the street. A cluster of junior analysts stood near the building directory with their visitor badges, talking too loudly about something none of them would remember by Friday. Mason crossed the lobby floor without looking at any of them. He made it about 12 feet from the elevator before he stopped. Not because anyone blocked him, not because security called his name. He stopped because he'd reached the spot near the east windows where the morning light came through at a particular angle between 9:30 and 10, and for a few minutes every day it fell across that section of floor in a wide, warm column, and Mason had gotten into the habit over the years of pausing there when he passed through. Not for long, just a second or two, because it reminded him of the kitchen window at home, the way the light came through in the morning while he was making breakfast, the way Ella would sit at the table with her cereal and hold her spoon up to catch it. He stood in the light for exactly 3 seconds. Then he adjusted the box under his arm and walked out through the revolving door. The termination had taken less than 4 minutes. That was the part Mason kept turning over as he sat down on the concrete ledge outside the building, the box balanced on his knees, the November air finding its way through his jacket collar. Less than 4 minutes. He'd been in longer conversations about the coffee machine. It had started the way those things always start, with Brandon Pierce appearing in the doorway of Mason's shared workspace like a weather system everyone could feel before it arrived. Brandon was the kind of man who filled a room differently than other people, who made the air tighten a little, who caused keyboards to suddenly get very busy even when there was nothing urgent to type. He was 38, broad across the shoulders, and had the voice of someone who had decided somewhere in his early 20s that volume was the same thing as authority. Walker. Just the last name, the way Brandon always said it, like he was calling attendance. Mason looked up from his screen. He'd been in the middle of a workflow analysis for the third-floor logistics team, a project nobody had asked him to do, and nobody would probably notice unless it saved them 11% on quarterly processing overhead, which it would. But that wasn't the point. He did it because the problem was there, and the problem bothered him. "Yeah," Mason said, "my office." The office was a glass-walled corner space with the blinds always halfway down, which gave it the uncomfortable quality of being both visible and obscured. Brandon sat behind his desk without offering Mason a chair. Mason stood. He'd learned early on that sitting down uninvited in Brandon's office was the kind of thing that got filed away and used later. "You left at 2:15 yesterday," Brandon said. He had a file open on the desk in front of him, though he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at Mason with the specific expression of someone who has already decided how this conversation ends. "I did," Mason said. "That's the 3rd time this month you've left before 4. There were 2 times before that I stayed until 7:30, One time I came in on a Saturday. I'm not talking about when you stayed late. I'm talking about when you left early. Brandon leaned back in his chair. Look, I've tried to work with you, Walker. I've tried to give you the benefit of the doubt, but at some point I have to think about the rest of the team, about the message it sends when one person gets to operate by a different set of rules. I left because my daughter was sick at school, Mason said. He said it plainly, without apology or decoration, the way you say something that should not require explanation. She had a fever. The school called me. I finished what was time-sensitive and I left. Did you tell anyone? I sent you a message. A message. Brandon said it like it was a foreign word. Yeah, at 2:08. I have it if you want to. I don't need to see the message, Mason. The issue isn't the message. Brandon closed the file. There it was. The telling gesture, the closing of a folder that probably had nothing important in it. The issue is a pattern. The issue is that I can't build a high-performance team around someone who isn't here. Mason looked at him for a moment. He thought about the 11%. I thought about Ella's voice on the phone when the school nurse had put her through, that small, rough sound she got when her throat hurt, the way she'd said daddy before anything else. Not even hello, just daddy, because that was the only thing she needed to establish first. Are you firing me? Mason asked. Brandon looked almost relieved, like he'd been hoping Mason would ask so he didn't have to be the one to introduce the word. We're moving in a different direction, he said. HR will handle the paperwork. Right, Mason said. He went back to his desk, cleared it in 8 minutes. Someone, he never found out who, had already put the cardboard box on the edge of his workstation by the time he got there, and he appreciated the anonymity of that small act more than he could have said. He packed the photograph of Ella first, then the little cactus she'd given him on the first day of his 3rd year, the one she'd painted a face on with her nail polish, lopsided and cheerful and completely sincere. He left everything else. Whoa. Outside, the cold was the honest kind. No wind, just temperature, the sort of November morning that doesn't pretend to be anything it isn't. Mason sat on the ledge with the box on his knees and took out his phone and looked at Ella's contact. Not to call. She was in school. She'd be fine by now. The nurse had said it was probably just the start of a cold. He just looked at her name for a minute. Ella Walker, with the little star emoji she'd added herself one afternoon when she'd grabbed his phone and thought she was being sneaky about it. He put the phone back in his pocket. The street was doing what streets do at 10 in the morning. Delivery trucks double parked, a woman arguing cheerfully with a parking meter, 2 pigeons investigating something near the curb with the absolute confidence of animals that have never once been wrong about food. Mason watched them without particularly thinking about them, the way your eyes find a point to rest when your mind is somewhere else entirely. He was thinking about Ella, not about the job, not about Brandon Pierce, not about the 4 minutes, not about any of the things that a different kind of man might be running through right now. The injustice, the documentation, the question of what he'd tell people, whether he had grounds to fight it. Those thoughts weren't absent exactly. They were just very far away, like sounds from another room, present but not urgent. What was urgent was the evening. He needed to figure out dinner. Ella liked soup when she was sick, but she was specific about it. Not the canned kind. She had opinions about the canned kind that she had expressed at length, and with remarkable consistency for a 7-year-old. He'd have to stop at the market on the way home, and she'd want the couch, and the blanket that was technically her mother's but had been Ella's since before she was old enough to understand why. And she'd want him to sit beside her even if she fell asleep in 20 minutes, because she'd wake up and check that he was there before she fell asleep again. He could do that. He had the whole afternoon now, was the dark irony of it. He could be home by 11. He was almost smiling at this, at the grim arithmetic of it, fired at 9:47, home by 11, soup on the stove by noon, when he heard it. The sound of engines. Multiple engines close together, the particular sound of vehicles moving in coordination rather than traffic. He looked up. 3 black SUVs had turned onto the street from the north, moving in a tight line with the unhurried certainty of a convoy that doesn't worry about parking. Behind them, a 4th vehicle, longer, lower, the kind of car that doesn't have a model name most people would recognize because most people have never been in a situation where they'd need to. They pulled to the curb in front of the building entrance with the precision of something rehearsed. Mason looked at them with mild, distant curiosity, the way you look at something that has nothing to do with you. The first SUV's door opened and a man stepped out. 60s, silver hair, wearing a suit that fit him the way suits fit men who stopped thinking about suits years ago because they'd solved the problem permanently. He moved to the rear door of the long car and opened it himself rather than waiting, which was unusual, which meant whoever was inside was either someone he genuinely deferred to or someone he genuinely feared. And in Mason's experience, those were not always different things. Mason looked back down at his phone. He almost missed what happened next. Inside the lobby, the morning had continued being ordinary. The security guard had stopped scrolling his phone. The junior analysts had dispersed toward the elevators. The revolving door was pushing in that steady cold gust, in and out, the building breathing. On the 14th floor, in the open workspace that Mason Walker had just vacated, 3 people were quietly having a conversation about whether the box had really only had 2 things in it, because that detail felt like the kind of thing that got exaggerated in the retelling. "It was 3 things," said a woman named Priya, who had the desk nearest the window and had therefore had the best angle. "There was a picture, that little cactus, and I think some papers or something." "I didn't see any papers," said the man beside her, whose name was Garrett, and who had been at the company for 8 months, and had therefore not yet fully understood what was unusual and what wasn't. "I'm just saying it didn't look like much." 3 years of work and it fits in a copy paper box," said a third voice, quieter than the others. Her name was Dana, and she had been Mason's closest thing to a work friend, which mostly meant they'd had lunch together 11 times. And she'd asked him once about his daughter, and he'd shown her 3 pictures on his phone, and she'd actually thought, standing there watching him leave, "I should have asked more." She should have asked more, and she hadn't, and now he was gone, and she was holding her coffee cup with both hands, like it was something to hold on to. "That's what I'm saying. It didn't look like much." Nobody answered that. Brandon Pierce was in his office with the blinds adjusted. Not quite closed, not quite open. I was on his phone talking to someone from HR about the paperwork, his voice carrying the brisk efficiency of a man executing a decision rather than questioning one. He had not gone to the window to watch Mason leave. That detail would bother him later, in the specific way that small failures of nerve do, the ones that don't seem significant until they do. The lobby security guard, whose name was Phil, and who had worked the morning desk for 6 years, and who had therefore seen a considerable number of things, walked out from behind the security desk and stood at the interior side of the revolving door and watched the convoy with his arms loose at his sides and his face doing the careful professional blankness of someone who is paying very close attention. 4 vehicles. 8 visible personnel that he could count. 3 more still in the SUVs, probably. The silver-haired man in the good suit had not come inside yet. He was standing at the curb, his back to the building, looking at something. Looking, Phil realized, at the man sitting on the ledge. Phil had seen Mason Walker walk out 40 minutes ago and hadn't thought anything of it, except that it seemed like a rough morning. He'd been in the job long enough to recognize the cardboard box situation without being told. He'd given Mason a small nod as he passed. Not the formal visitor acknowledgement nod, the other one, the human one. And Mason had given him a small nod back, and that had been that. Now Phil looked between the man on the ledge and the man from the convoy and felt the particular sensation of a story he didn't know all the pieces to. The silver-haired man said something to the person beside him. That person said something into an earpiece. And then, very deliberately, the silver-haired man walked not toward the building's entrance, but toward the ledge where Mason Walker was sitting with a cardboard box on his knees, looking at something on his phone. Phil watched Mason look up. He watched Mason's expression do something complicated and quiet. Not surprise exactly, or not only surprise. And then Mason stood, and the silver-haired man extended his hand, and Mason shook it, and whatever was said between them was too far away and too low to hear. Phil went back to the desk and picked up the phone and called upstairs to the 14th floor without quite knowing why, and when someone answered, it turned out to be Donna, who had gone back to her desk but had been staring at the same paragraph for 20 minutes. He said, "You might want to come down to the lobby." "Why?" Dana asked. Phil looked at the scene through the glass doors. More people had gotten out of the vehicles now. They were arranged, he noticed, in a way that was oddly deliberate. Not aggressive, not confrontational, but oriented. Like planets around a particular center of gravity. The center of gravity was Mason Walker. "I'm not totally sure," Phil said honestly, "but I think someone just made a very large mistake." On the 14th floor, Brandon Pierce had finished his call with HR. He set his phone down and looked out through the half-open blinds at the open workspace floor, at the empty desk with the cleared surface, and the faint square where the monitor stand had compressed the desk, matte slightly over 3 years of holding the same weight. He looked at it for a moment. Then his own phone buzzed. A text from someone on the lobby floor. One of the analysts, he thought, though he didn't recognize the number immediately. The text said only, "You need to see this." And a second later, because whoever sent it felt that wasn't sufficient, "Brandon, I'm serious. Come down." He stared at the message. He thought about Mason Walker's face during those 4 minutes. The particular quality of Mason's stillness, not the stillness of someone too defeated to react, not the stunned immobility of a person absorbing a blow. Something else. Something Brandon hadn't been able to name at the time and was having trouble naming now. He thought about the message at 2:08. He'd seen it. He'd seen it, and he'd chosen to handle it the morning after rather than in the moment, because the morning after felt cleaner, felt more formal, felt more like a managed decision and less like a reaction. He'd seen the message and he'd read the words, "Ella is sick," heading to pick her up, finished the Mercer analysis before leaving, and he'd set his phone down and thought, tomorrow. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. He told himself he was curious. That was all. Just curious. He took the elevator down. The lobby had gone very quiet by the time he got there. Not silent. The building's sounds were still happening, the HVAC system and the revolving door and the distant elevator chimes. But the human layer of it, the ambient noise of people moving through space without thinking about it, had stilled. People who'd been crossing the lobby had stopped. The junior analysts who'd gone back down for coffee were standing near the cafe entrance, not going anywhere. Phil at the security desk was very upright, very still, watching. Through the glass front of the building, Brandon could see the convoy. 4 vehicles, he counted, and the people outside, and in the middle of it all, talking to a silver-haired man he didn't recognize but whose bearing and whose suit and whose convoy told him everything he needed to know about the category of person he was looking at, was Mason Walker. Still in the same jacket, still holding the cardboard box, or it was on the ledge beside him. He couldn't tell from here. A hand settled on Brandon's arm, light but deliberate. He turned. It was Dana from the 14th floor, who had come down in the other elevator. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking through the glass. "Do you know who that is?" she asked. "The man talking to Mason?" "No," Brandon said. "I just looked him up." She showed him her phone. A photo. The same silver-haired man, 15 years younger maybe, at some kind of industry event. The caption underneath, "He's the executive chairman of Viridian Technologies." Brandon looked at the phone. He looked at the lobby. He thought about the 4 minutes. He looked at the photo again, and then past it, through the glass, at Mason Walker standing in the November morning with his cardboard box beside him, apparently completely comfortable with the most powerful executive in the technology sector waiting for him to finish a thought. Something cold moved through Brandon's chest that had nothing to do with the revolving door. "What does that mean?" he said, though some part of him, the part that had been quietly running calculations since he came out of the elevator, already knew. Dana looked at him. She put her phone back in her pocket. "I think," she said carefully, "that you fired the wrong person." Dana's words landed in the lobby air and stayed there, the way certain sentences do, not echoing exactly, but refusing to dissolve. Brandon Pierce stood very still beside her, and for a moment he looked less like the regional manager of a mid-sized logistics technology firm, and more like a man who had just realized he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't see the bottom of. Through the glass, Mason Walker was still talking to the silver-haired man. Not animatedly, not with the body language of someone receiving important news or being celebrated or confronted. He was standing with one hand in his jacket pocket and his weight slightly to one side, the cardboard box on the ledge behind him, and he was listening to whatever the silver-haired man was saying with the particular quality of attention that Mason brought to most things. Complete, unhurried, a little difficult to read. Brandon watched him and thought about the message at 2:08 and felt the cold thing in his chest spread a little further. "Viridian Technologies," he said. The name tasted strange now, in a way it hadn't 20 minutes ago. Viridian was not a company you dropped casually into conversation. Viridian was the kind of name that appeared in financial headlines and industry keynotes, and the sort of long-form profiles in business magazines that people left in waiting rooms and nobody read, and then someone did and came away feeling vaguely unsettled about how much money existed in the world. The executive chairman, Dana said again, as if repetition would help one of them understand it better. It wasn't helping. Brandon looked at the convoy, counted the vehicles again as if the number might have changed. It hadn't. 4. 8 or 9 visible people outside, and the way they were oriented, the way even casual movement of one of them seemed to refer back to where Mason was standing. It had the quality of something organized around a fixed point. He said, "There has to be an explanation." Dana looked at him sideways. "Yeah," she said, "there probably is." She walked away toward the security desk, and Brandon stood alone in the middle of the lobby with the revolving door pushing cold air in at his back, and he did not move for a long time. What nobody in that building knew, what nobody who worked there had ever known, or had any particular reason to suspect, was that Mason Walker had been tired for a very long time. Not the ordinary tired, not the tired of long hours or short sleep, or the specific fatigue of working for someone like Brandon Pierce, though that contributed its share. The tired he carried was older than any of that. It had taken up residence in him the morning he came back from the hospital without Claire, and it had never fully left, and he had built his entire life in the years since around the task of not letting Ella see it. He had gotten very good at that task. Good enough that most mornings, by the time Ella came downstairs in her socks with one of them half off the way she always slept, her hair doing 3 different things at once, announcing her breakfast preferences with the confidence of someone reading from a menu, he had the tired mostly managed, locked away in whatever internal room he'd built for it. Present, but not visible. That was the daily work of it. That was what nobody saw. What they saw was a quiet man in average clothes who made no trouble, offered no particular opinions in meetings, filed things on time, left early sometimes without sufficient explanation, and generally gave the impression of someone who was simply there, occupying space without animating it, present without being notable. In a competitive office environment, this was almost its own kind of invisibility. People saw what they expected to see, which was a man with modest ambitions living a modest life, and they stopped looking after that because there was nothing that demanded they look further. The truth was that Mason had designed it that way, not cynically, not as some elaborate performance, but because it was what he'd needed, and because it was what Ella needed, and because the alternative was unthinkable. The alternative was this. Mason Walker, age 26, had founded Viridian Technologies in a 2-room office above a dry cleaner on a street that no longer existed in a neighborhood that had since been developed beyond recognition. He had started it with a software engineer named Paul Yates, who was 3 years older than him and drank too much coffee and argued about everything and was the smartest person Mason had ever met, and a business analyst named Sandra Okafor, who had walked away from a position at a firm that paid her 4 times as much because she believed in what they were building and also because she liked Mason, in the specific way some people take to certain other people, not romantically but structurally. Like she recognized the shape of him and thought, yes, that's a person worth working with. They had built something. This is an insufficient way to describe it, but the sufficient description would take the kind of time Mason no longer spent on the subject. What they built was a platform, a logistics and supply chain intelligence system that did something other platforms didn't do, which was think ahead rather than report back, which sounds simple and was not, which turned out to be worth more than any of them had initially understood. They spent 4 years nearly broke, then 18 months less broke, then 6 months during which the trajectory became unmistakably clear, and then a morning when Mason was eating a bowl of cereal in his apartment, and Paul called him and said, "So I've been looking at the offer from Kellerman Group," and Mason said, "Yeah," and Paul said, "Mason, I think we should take it," and there was a long pause, and Mason said, "Yeah, I think so too." He was 29 years old when he signed the papers that made him, on paper, worth more than he could fully process. He was 30 when Claire was diagnosed. He was 31 when Ella was born, 8 weeks early, tiny and loud and perfect, arriving into a world where her mother was already fighting something that the doctors had stopped using optimistic language about. He was 32 when Claire died on a Thursday morning in March, with the light coming through the hospital window in a way that was completely indifferent to the occasion. Ella was 11 months old. The decision to disappear hadn't been a single decision. It had been more like a series of small choices that accumulated in one direction, the way a river doesn't decide to reach the sea but ends up there anyway. First, he couldn't be the version of himself that Viridian needed him to be anymore. That version, the one who arrived early and stayed late and had opinions about product roadmaps and spoke in investor meetings and was comfortable being photographed at industry events, felt like a costume he'd worn for years and now could not find the motivation to put back on. It wasn't grief making him useless. It was grief making that life feel like it belonged to someone else entirely. Like he was reading about a man who had done those things rather than being that man. Second, Ella. He kept coming back to Ella. She was 11 months old and she was his, completely, and she didn't know yet what she'd lost, and he couldn't do anything about that. Couldn't go back and fix the part of her life where her mother wouldn't be, but he could do something about who was there instead. He could be there. Actually there. Not the version of there that meant home by 8 on a good night and traveling on Mondays. Not the version that meant a nanny and a nice house and a father she saw across a dinner table 4 times a week. He wanted to be the one who knew what cereal she liked. Third, and this one was harder to explain even to himself, he didn't want Ella to grow up understanding money the way children who grow up around large amounts of it tend to. He'd seen it in his years in that world. The particular quality of distance it created, the way it made everything slightly provisional, everything slightly replaceable. He wanted her to understand that the world was not arranged for her convenience. He wanted her to understand what it was like to work for things. He wanted her to have the kind of childhood where she had to save up for something she wanted, and the saving was part of the point. So he handed control of Viridian to Richard Holt, the silver-haired man, the executive chairman, who had been on the board from the early days, and who Mason trusted in the particular way you trust someone who has disagreed with you productively for years. And he restructured his ownership to be passive and private, and he moved to a different city, and he found a job at a logistics analytics company that would not have recognized his name because his name had never been publicly associated with Viridian's founding in any searchable way, because Mason had always preferred to be behind the product rather than in front of it. He rented a house with a backyard that had 1 tree in it, which Ella immediately identified as the most important feature. He enrolled her in the elementary school 3 blocks away. He bought a grocery store's worth of cereal options and let her pick the one she liked, and it turned out to be the plain kind, the simple round ones in the yellow box, which said something about her he couldn't have predicted but which charmed him completely. He made dinner every night. He was not a natural cook. Claire had been the cook, confident and experimental, and occasionally producing things that were great and occasionally producing things that required an emergency pizza. But he learned, slowly, imperfectly, burning things and under-seasoning things, and making the same 3 soups in rotation until Ella started gently lobbying for variety, which she did by saying, "Daddy, I love your soup," in a tone that clearly meant but. He helped with homework at the kitchen table. He went to school events and stood in the back near the door so he could leave quickly if he needed to without climbing over people, which was how he navigated most group situations. He took Ella to the park on Saturdays and sat on the bench while she used the climbing structure with the focused intensity she brought to anything physical, and he drank his coffee and watched her, and there were moments, not all the time, but moments, when the weight he carried got briefly lighter and he could breathe all the way down. He did not talk about Viridian. He did not think about it more than necessary. He had an arrangement with Richard that required almost nothing of him day to day, just quarterly calls and annual reviews, and the occasional decision that rose to the level of needing the actual founder's input rather than the executive board's, which happened rarely. He kept a separate phone for those calls. Ella had never seen it. He went to work at Halverson Analytics and did his job well and made no particular impression on anyone, which was more or less the point. His first week at Halverson, a woman named Priya had shown him how the coffee machine worked. His second week, a man named Garrett had asked him to proofread a client report because, Garrett explained with complete transparency, he was bad at grammar and didn't trust himself. Mason had proofread it, fixed 7 things, and handed it back without making Garrett feel bad about any of them, which Garrett appreciated enough that he mentioned it to someone, which was how Mason ended up becoming the unofficial proofreader for the team's external communications, a role he'd never been asked to take and had never refused. He had noticed early on that the logistics systems Halverson used for internal workflow were inefficient in ways that created real costs. He had written up an analysis, quietly, in his own time, and left it in the shared drive in a folder labeled Process Notes, in a way that meant anyone could find it, but nobody would feel like it was being pushed on them. Someone found it 3 weeks later and brought it to a team meeting as their own observation, and Mason had sat through the meeting and not said anything, and the recommendation had been adopted and the quarterly processing overhead had dropped by 11%. He watched things. He noticed things. He didn't announce them. He understood now, sitting on the ledge outside with Richard Holt standing in front of him, saying things Mason wasn't entirely tracking, because the morning had been strange, and his mind kept going back to Ella's voice on the phone. Daddy. This was the thing that had never registered with Brandon Pierce as a form of intelligence. Brandon valued what he could see and measure: noise, speed, assertion, the performance of effort. Mason had never performed effort. He just did it and moved on. The quarterly numbers are better than projected, Richard was saying. He had the comfortable cadence of a man who understood that the person he was talking to didn't need preamble. That was one of the things Mason had always appreciated about him. And the infrastructure build-out in the northern corridor is on track. I've been wanting to loop you in for the past few months, but he paused, looked at the cardboard box on the ledge. There were other things. There were other things, Mason agreed. How is she? She's good. He meant it. That was the complicated thing. He meant it completely. She's smart, and she's a little difficult, and she has opinions about everything. She told me last week that she thinks the school cafeteria is philosophically depressing. She's 7. Richard looked at him for a moment. She sounds like you. She sounds like Claire, Mason said. It came out even, the way he'd learned to say it. Not flat. That was the other thing, the thing that required its own discipline, keeping the flatness out of it, not letting the management of grief turn into the erasure of it. Just even. Richard nodded. He didn't say he was sorry. They'd passed that point years ago, and they both knew it, and the not saying it was its own form of respect. You didn't have to come personally, Mason said. I know. Richard looked at the building behind Mason, at the revolving door, and what was visible through it, the lobby that had stilled itself, the people who were pretending not to watch. But I was in the city for the Kellerman meeting, and your flag on the morning's notification was your address, and I thought... He stopped, started again. I wanted to see what the situation looked like before I started making calls. And what does it look like? Richard glanced again at the lobby, at the barely visible figures just inside the glass. It looks like an interesting Tuesday morning, he said, for several people. Mason almost laughed. It came out more like a breath. He picked up the cardboard box from the ledge and looked at Ella's cactus, the lopsided face staring back up at him with its painted expression of permanent, cheerful blankness, and he thought, I need to get home and make soup. Richard, he said. Yeah. I'm going to need a couple of days before we talk about whatever you actually came here to talk about. Understood, Richard said, with the simplicity of a man who doesn't argue about things that don't need arguing about. My daughter's sick. I want to be home. Of course. Mason nodded. He shifted the box under his arm and looked at the building one more time, the glass front, the lobby, the still and watching faces, and something moved through him that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite satisfaction. More like the recognition of a moment. He had spent 3 years being invisible in that building. He had chosen the invisibility, had built it carefully and maintained it with intention, and he did not regret it. But Brandon Pierce had fired him for leaving to take care of a sick child. That specific thing, not the early departure, not the abstract pattern, not the failure to notify by some preferred channel, but the real thing, the human thing underneath all the managerial language that stuck, that sat in his chest like something unresolved. He thought about the 11%. He thought about the proofreading. I thought about the 3 years of quiet work that had been rendered invisible not by his own design, but by someone else's refusal to see it. He thought about Ella on the phone, saying Daddy first. He started toward the street, toward the direction where he'd parked 2 blocks away, and he had taken maybe 4 steps when the lobby doors opened and the revolving door turned and a small cluster of people came out. Not many. Phil, the security guard, Dana, and 2 or 3 others he recognized from the 14th floor. They didn't come toward him exactly. They just came out, the way people drift toward a thing they need to witness, and stood near the building entrance. And then, because the morning had already accumulated several things it hadn't warned him about, a van pulled up behind the rear vehicle of Richard's convoy, A different kind of van, plain white with a logo on the side Mason didn't recognize, and the passenger door opened and a woman's voice said, "Richard, I told you to hold the meeting." Richard turned. The van's side door had slid open, and a ramp was extending from it to the curb. At the top of the ramp, framed by the van's door in a dark coat with her laptop bag across her lap, was Charlotte Hayes. Mason had heard of Charlotte Hayes. Anyone connected to Viridian's orbit had heard of Charlotte Hayes. She'd joined the company 3 years after he'd stepped back, built the commercial division from $17 million in revenue to something that required a different category of number. And then in the accident, he knew the broad outlines, not the details, because he made a practice of not learning details he didn't need. She'd been seriously and permanently injured, and she'd come back to the company and taken the CEO chair and reportedly made the board uncomfortable in a productive way for 18 months before they stopped being uncomfortable and started being grateful. He had never met her in person. She came down the ramp with the efficiency of someone who stopped performing inconvenience a long time ago. The wheelchair moved onto the sidewalk pavement, and she looked at Richard with the specific expression of someone who asked a reasonable thing and was not entirely surprised, but still disappointed that it hadn't happened. "I said, hold the Viridian conversation," she said. "I didn't say drive your convoy to—" She looked at the building, then at the cardboard box under Mason's arm, then at Mason. "Is this him?" Richard, to his credit, did not try to manage the moment. "Charlotte Hayes," he said. "This is Mason Walker." Charlotte Hayes looked at Mason Walker. She had quick eyes, dark, the kind that took inventory fast and without apology. She looked at the box, at the cactus with the painted face, at his jacket, which was a perfectly ordinary jacket, at his face. "You got fired this morning," she said. "About an hour ago, yeah," Mason said. "By someone who works in my company." Mason considered this. "Technically, your company is separate from—" "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "I know the corporate structure. That's Halverson, right? We own 31% of Halverson." He hadn't known that. He absorbed it without showing much. "Okay," he said. "Who was it?" Richard put a hand up. "Charlotte." "I'm not asking Richard," she said. "I'm asking him." Mason looked at her for a moment. She was holding her laptop bag strap with one hand, and there was something about the set of her jaw that reminded him, oddly, of Ella. When she was waiting for an answer she already suspected wasn't going to be the one she wanted. Patient, but not infinitely so. "His name is Brandon Pierce," Mason said. "He's the regional manager." Charlotte didn't write it down. She didn't need to. She turned to one of the people who had come out of the first SUV, a woman with a tablet who had materialized at the edge of the group with the quiet readiness of someone who was very good at her job, and said, "Halverson, regional manager Brandon Pierce. I want his file on my screen before we go inside." "Yes," the woman said, and stepped away. Charlotte turned back to Mason. She looked at him again in that direct inventorying way, and then she looked at the building behind him, at the glass front and the lobby and the people who were pretending very hard not to watch. And her expression shifted slightly, not softening exactly, but gaining something. Gravity, maybe. "I came here for a routine site inspection," she said. "I do them every quarter. Halverson is in the portfolio, and I like to see things myself." She paused. "I did not expect the morning to go this particular direction." "Neither did I," Mason said. He meant it as a mild, flat statement, and it came out, to his own surprise, with something in it. Some small edge that he hadn't intended, but also couldn't quite regret. Charlotte heard it. He could tell she heard it because she didn't respond to the surface of it, the politeness. She responded to the thing underneath. "No," she said quietly. "I imagine you didn't." She looked at the cardboard box one more time, at the cactus with the lopsided painted face. "Your daughter gave you that?" she asked. He didn't ask how she knew. He looked at the cactus. "Yeah," he said. "First week of my 3rd year. She thought it would make my desk look friendlier." Charlotte was quiet for a moment, not thinking. She didn't have the quality of someone who needed to gather herself, more like she was letting something settle. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I have a building full of people who apparently worked alongside you for 3 years and had no idea who you were." "That was by design," he said. "I know." She didn't sound accusatory about it, just precise. "What I'm asking is, was this morning by design too?" The question was smarter than it looked, and he knew she knew it was smarter than it looked. No, he said after a moment. This morning was Brandon Pierce deciding that a sick kid was an inconvenience instead of a reason. Something shifted in Charlotte Hayes's face, brief and then gone. He couldn't name what it was precisely, but it felt like recognition, the specific kind that comes from personal experience rather than abstract understanding. She looked at Richard. "We're going inside," she said. Richard looked at Mason. Mason stood on the sidewalk with his cardboard box and his daughter's cactus, and 3 years of quiet work that had just been reclassified, in the space of a single Tuesday morning, as something other than what most people in that building had believed it to be. He thought about the soup. He thought about the blanket on the couch, and the way Ella slept, checking without opening her eyes that he was still there. He looked at Charlotte Hayes, who was waiting without appearing to wait, which was its own skill. "Okay," he said. He followed her inside. The lobby received them the way lobbies receive things they don't know how to categorize, with a kind of held-breath stillness that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite noise, but was something suspended between the two. Phil at the security desk stood very straight. The junior analyst who had drifted in from the street were still there, not going anywhere, with the transparent implausibility of people who have decided that whatever is happening is more important than wherever they were headed. Dana stood near the elevator bank with her arms crossed, not in the defensive way, but in the way of someone who is cold and also paying very close attention. Even the revolving door seemed to slow its rhythm, as if the building itself had picked up on something in the air and was waiting to find out what it meant. Mason came through the door last, behind Charlotte and Richard and the small constellation of people who moved with them, and the lobby's stillness shifted slightly when he entered, a small collective recalibration, people adjusting their angle of attention without quite meaning to. He still had the cardboard box. He'd thought briefly about leaving it in the van or setting it outside, but that had seemed like a gesture, and he was tired of gestures this morning, tired of anything that required reading or interpretation. The box was his. He kept it. Charlotte had already reached the center of the lobby floor, and she stopped there with the natural authority of someone who doesn't need to establish it. Her wheelchair moved across the polished marble with a quiet efficiency that made the space look like it had been designed with her in mind, which it hadn't. He'd been in enough Halverson offices to know they'd been built in the era when accessible meant an afterthought near the freight elevator. But she navigated it without acknowledgement, which told him this was just Tuesday for her. Every Tuesday. She looked up at the building directory, then at the elevator bank, then at the general population of the lobby, who were all looking at her. "I need the 14th floor," she said. Not loudly. It carried anyway. Phil said, "I'll call up and let them know." "No need," Charlotte said. She looked at him with something that wasn't unkind but was direct. "I'd prefer they didn't know I'm coming. That's generally the point of an unannounced inspection." Phil processed this. "Yes, ma'am." The elevator opened. The 14th floor did not know she was coming. What the 14th floor knew, in the 10 minutes since Brandon had come back upstairs from the lobby, was approximately this. Something was happening downstairs involving Mason Walker and a large number of vehicles, and a man that Dana had looked up and identified as someone connected to a technology company that nobody on the floor could name with confidence from memory, but which Dana had described with an expression that communicated large and important and significantly above our pay grade. Brandon had come back from the lobby and gone directly to his office and closed the blinds all the way, which he never did, which meant something. Priya and Garrett had resumed the posture of working without actually working, keyboards making sounds, while eyes went sideways. 3 other people on the floor had quietly texted someone on the floors below asking if anyone down there knew what was going on. Nobody down there knew what was going on either, but they were all very invested in finding out. The elevator opened. The first thing the 14th floor registered was not Charlotte Hayes, because Charlotte came second off the elevator, after 2 of the people who traveled with her who had the practiced movement of people whose job it is to enter a room before the person they're with. The first thing the 14th floor registered was the energy, a specific compression of attention, of importance, the kind you feel before you see the source of it, like pressure before weather. Then Charlotte came off the elevator, and then Richard, and then Mason, still carrying the box. Priya's fingers stopped moving over her keyboard. Garrett looked up and then looked at Priya and then looked back. Charlotte moved through the workspace floor at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, scanning. Her eyes went over the workstations, the layout, the sightlines, the window placement, the cluster of people who had frozen mid-motion. She was taking inventory. She did it without commentary, without making people feel observed, though everyone felt observed. That was the skill of it. She stopped near the center of the floor, looked at the empty desk with the cleared surface and the slight compression mark where Mason's monitor had sat for 3 years. She looked at it for a moment. "Which office is Brandon Pierce's?" she said. Nobody answered immediately, not because they didn't know. Everyone knew the glass-walled corner space was visible from almost anywhere on the floor, but because saying it felt like a choice, and nobody wanted to be the person who made that particular choice first. Then Dana, from somewhere behind Mason, said, "Corner, the one with the blinds down." Charlotte nodded. She started toward it. "What?" Brandon Pierce heard them before he saw them, which gave him approximately 4 seconds to decide what to do with his face. He used those 4 seconds to close whatever was on his screen, sit up straighter, and compose himself into the expression of a man who was in the middle of a busy morning and receiving an unexpected interruption. It was a competent performance. He'd given versions of it before. But there's a difference between composing yourself for an interruption you've anticipated and composing yourself for one that includes your recently fired employee walking in behind a woman you have never seen in this building, but whose presence has the specific weight of someone who has authority over decisions you cannot reverse. Charlotte opened his office door without knocking. She came in and positioned herself across the desk from him with the precision of someone who has done this in many rooms, and she looked at him the way she'd looked at the lobby directory, cataloging, patient, thorough. "Brandon Pierce," she said. "Yes." He got to his feet, force of habit. "Can I ask who—" "Charlotte Hayes." She didn't extend a hand, not in the dismissive way, just matter-of-factly. "I'm the CEO of Viridian Technologies. We have a significant ownership position in Halverson Analytics. I'm here on a quarterly inspection." Brandon looked past her at Richard, who had remained in the doorway. Then at Mason, who had stopped just outside the glass wall and was not looking in, was looking at the floor or at nothing, which was somehow worse than if he'd been watching. "Of course," Brandon said. I wasn't notified that—" "That's the point of an unannounced inspection," Charlotte said. She looked at his desk, at the closed laptop, at the file that he'd pushed to one side. "Sit down, please." He sat. She didn't. "This morning," she said, "an employee was terminated on this floor." Brandon organized his hands on the desk. "That's correct. I made a personnel decision based on a documented— His name is Mason Walker." "Yes." "He left work early yesterday afternoon." "That's part of a pattern of— To pick up his sick daughter from school," Charlotte said. The word daughter landed in the room with a weight that Brandon hadn't expected, which was its own information about him. "He didn't follow the proper notification. He sent you a message at 2:08, Charlotte said. "We pulled the communication logs this morning. The message said he was leaving to pick up his daughter, that she had a fever, and that he'd completed the time-sensitive deliverables before leaving. You read it at 2:14. Silence. Brandon's hands were very still on the desk. "You read it," Charlotte said again, not louder, "and you chose to address it the following morning rather than in the moment, which is a choice you're entitled to make as a manager. But then you addressed it by terminating him, without asking him to explain, without a formal review process, without—" She stopped, looked at him steadily. "Did you ask him why he left?" "I gave him the opportunity." "Did you ask him directly? Did you say, 'Mason, why did you leave early yesterday?'" Brandon said nothing. Charlotte let the silence be what it was. "He told you," she said. "When you didn't ask, he told you anyway. He said his daughter was sick, and then you told him you were moving in a different direction." Brandon's jaw was tight. "I had documented performance concerns that predate 3 instances in 4 months of leaving before 4 o'clock, Charlotte said. She looked at him with something that wasn't contempt, not quite. It was too measured for contempt, more like the expression of someone who has run the numbers and found them wanting. 2 of which were on days when he had stayed past 7, none of which affected his output, which— She paused. Richard, from the doorway, said, the Mercer analysis he referenced in his message. Standard completion timeline for a document of that scope is 3 to 4 business days. He completed it in 1, in addition to his regular workload. Brandon said, I wasn't aware that. No, Charlotte said. You weren't. The office had the particular quality of a room where everyone present understands that the conversation has already arrived at its destination, and the remaining words are just the accounting of how they got there. Brandon understood this. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had made a fast decision based on incomplete information and who was now in a glass-walled office with the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company looking at him with the steady patience of someone who has time on her side and knows it. Through the glass, he could see Mason still standing in the workspace, still not watching. Someone had brought Mason a chair without being asked. Priya, he thought. And Mason had set the cardboard box on the floor beside it and sat down. And he was looking at his phone with an expression that Brandon recognized from 3 years of working on the same floor as this man. The expression of someone thinking about something entirely elsewhere. Probably thinking about his kid. Brandon looked at the cardboard box through the glass. At the cactus with the painted face. He said, "What happens now?" Charlotte looked at him for a moment. "That depends on several things," she said. "But before we discuss it, and we will discuss it, there's something that needs to happen first." She looked toward the open workspace floor. At Mason. At the people at their desks pretending not to watch. "I'd like everyone on this floor gathered," she said. "I'd like Mr. Walker to be present, and I'd like you to come with me." She moved toward the door. Brandon stood up from his desk for the second time that morning, and this time when he stood there was no performance in it, no posture of authority. He just stood, and it was just him, and it was heavier than he'd expected. The 14th floor assembled the way office floors do under extraordinary circumstances, with the slightly dazed compliance of people who understand something significant is happening, but haven't yet been given the vocabulary for it. Chairs were pulled from workstations and arranged in a rough semicircle near the windows without anyone directing it, the way people organize themselves around a center of gravity when the gravity is strong enough. Some people stood. The ones nearest the elevator were the least sure whether they should be there or not, and their uncertainty was visible in the way they kept one foot angled slightly back, a posture of readiness to retreat. Charlotte had positioned herself at the front of the loose gathering, by the windows, with the city visible behind her through the glass in a gray and ordinary way. Richard stood to one side. Mason was sitting in the chair Priya had brought him, still with the box, and he looked like a man who had not requested any of this and was tolerating it with the patience of someone who has a specific appointment elsewhere and keeps checking the internal clock. Brandon stood at the edge of the semicircle, not inside it, not outside it. The position of a man who has not yet determined what role he's playing. Charlotte looked at the assembled faces. Some she recognized from the brief she'd reviewed in the van on the way. Names, tenure, performance notes. Most she didn't. She'd been to this floor maybe twice in the past year, during full building walkthroughs, and both times it had been the kind of visit where you see the furniture and the metrics but not the people inside them. She thought about that now. "I'm Charlotte Hayes," she said for the room. "Most of you know that name from the company directory. I run the parent operation that has a stake in this firm, and I do quarterly inspections because I believe that what you see on a screen and what exists in a building are two different things, and the difference matters." She paused. This morning was supposed to be routine. Nobody said anything. The HVAC ran its low, indifferent sound. "I want to say something that isn't about policy," Charlotte said. "I want to say it directly, because I think it needs to be said directly and not through a memo or a process." She looked at the group and then, specifically, at Mason. 3 years ago, a man joined this team. He did his work. He did other people's work when he saw a gap, without credit. He left sometimes early, rarely, and with notification, because he is raising a child alone. She stopped. And this morning he was fired for it. The room had a specific texture of silence now. Not uncomfortable exactly. More like the silence of people who are being told something they already knew and are feeling the weight of having known it without having said it. Dana was looking at the floor. Priya's hands were in her lap. Garrett was looking at Mason, who was looking at nothing. Charlotte said, "I'm not here to make anyone feel bad. I'm here because I think the way a workplace responds to a moment like this one says something real about what kind of place it actually is, regardless of what it says it is. And I want to know what kind of place this is." She looked at Brandon. "So I'd like Mr. Pierce to address his team." Brandon had not been expecting to be called forward. He should have been. This was obviously building towards something. But knowing a thing is coming and being ready for it when it arrives are different experiences, and he hadn't been ready. He moved into the center of the space, stood there. The people on his team looked at him with the range of expressions that reflected 3 years of daily professional proximity, some guarded, some neutral, a few with the careful blankness of people who have opinions they've decided not to have visibly. Priya's expression was the most honest. She wasn't hostile. She just wasn't giving him anything to work with. Brandon looked at Mason. Mason looked back at him with the same expression he'd worn during those 4 minutes in the office. Not blank, not angry, just present. Complete. The expression of someone who is simply there, which was, Brandon realized now, the most disorienting expression you could face when you'd spent 3 years dismissing the person wearing it. "I made a decision this morning," Brandon said. He stopped. Started again. "I made a fast decision, and I made it without the information I should have had, and—" He stopped again. The sentence he'd been constructing, the managerial one, the one that was honest but organized, fell apart on him. He let it fall. "Mason told me why he left. I didn't listen to it. That's the truth of it. He said his daughter was sick, and I was already in the frame of it being a problem, and I didn't come out of that frame long enough to hear what he was actually saying." He was quiet for a moment. "That's on me." The room waited. Mason said quietly, "Okay." Brandon looked at him. I'm not asking for—" He stopped. "I just want to say it clearly, not to cover myself. I'm saying it because it's true, and you should hear it said clearly." Mason looked at him for a moment, then he nodded, once. Charlotte had been watching both of them. She turned now to Richard, and some small signal passed between them. Nothing visible enough to be named, just the communication of two people who have worked together long enough that agreement doesn't require elaboration. Richard reached into the interior pocket of his jacket. What he took out was not, as several people in the room half expected, a document or a folder or anything official in the paperwork sense. It was a phone. He looked at it, typed something, and said, without looking up, "I'm going to share something with the room. I want everyone to understand what it means before we go further." He looked at Charlotte. She nodded. "Mason Walker," Richard said, "is the founder of Viridian Technologies." The room absorbed this. It took a moment. Longer than you'd think, because information of that magnitude doesn't land immediately. It lands in stages, the first stage being the hearing of the words, the second being the processing of what the words are, and the third being the renegotiation of everything that came before the words in light of what the words mean. Priya was the first to visibly react. It was small. Her chin came up, and she looked at Mason with an expression that moved through disbelief and then through something more complicated, the specific expression of someone reassembling a picture they thought they understood and finding that none of the pieces fit the frame they'd put them in. Garrett said, out loud, in the way of someone who didn't mean to speak but did, "Wait." Dana didn't say anything. She was looking at Mason with an expression that was almost purely private, the expression of someone taking inventory of all the lunches and conversations and small interactions and running them through a new filter and feeling something specific about the result, though what specifically was hers to carry. Brandon Pierce's face had gone through several things very quickly and settled on nothing. It was the face of someone who has lost the ability to perform a coherent expression because too many things are competing for the same real estate. Charlotte said, to the room, "Viridian Technologies has a current valuation in excess of $12 billion. Mason Walker holds the founding stake." She paused. "He has held it while working on your team, in the desk by the window, for 3 years. She let that sit. Then she said, "He is also a single father. He left work early yesterday because his daughter had a fever. Those two things are both true at the same time, and both of them matter." Mason had been looking at the floor during this. Not in shame, in the posture of a man who has been talked about before and has found a way to be in the room for it without making it worse. He looked up now, and he looked at Charlotte, and there was something in his face that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite discomfort, more like the acknowledgement of something unavoidable. "I didn't need the second thing to matter because of the first thing," he said. It came out quietly, but it carried. Charlotte turned to him. "I know," she said. "I mean—" He stopped, found the right words and found they were also the simple ones. A guy who does good work and left early because his kid was sick should have been listened to regardless of what his net worth is. That's the thing I actually care about. The room was very quiet. Yes, Charlotte said. It is. And you're right. She looked at the assembled faces, at Brandon, at Priya, at Dana, at all of them. That's exactly what I'm here to say. What happened next did not happen in a single conversation or a single hour, because the things that needed to happen were not the kind that happen in single conversations or single hours, regardless of how dramatic the morning had been. What happened was this. Charlotte asked for the use of a conference room, and someone found her one, and she and Richard and Mason and Brandon and 2 people from Charlotte's team spent the better part of 2 hours in it. Mason called home and left a message for the neighbor who was keeping an eye on the house. Ella was still at school, the fever was manageable, he'd be home by early afternoon. He looked at his phone for a moment after hanging up, and then put it in his pocket and rejoined the conversation. The conference room was the large one on the 14th floor, with the whiteboard that always had something left on it from the previous meeting because nobody ever erased it completely. This time, it had a project timeline from 3 weeks ago, half faded. Mason looked at it once during the meeting and thought, I could fix that system. I could fix the whole system if someone wanted me to. He didn't say that. The meeting had a specific texture. It was not the texture of a negotiation, exactly, or of a confrontation. It was more like the texture of people assembling a truthful account of a situation from multiple angles simultaneously, which is harder than it sounds, because each person's angle contains things they've noticed that the others haven't, and things the others have noticed that they missed, and the assembly requires patience and a willingness to put your own angle down periodically in order to pick up someone else's. Charlotte was good at this. She asked questions the way certain people do, not to lead anywhere in particular, but because she actually wanted the answer, and the answer would actually change what she thought. Mason respected this without saying so. Brandon answered questions honestly. This was the thing Mason kept coming back to as the meeting moved through its stages. Brandon didn't deflect. He didn't construct. He laid out his reasoning as he'd had it at the time, including the parts where his reasoning had stopped engaging with available evidence, and he did it in a way that was clearly uncomfortable but not performed. The discomfort was real. That counted for something, even if Mason hadn't yet decided what exactly it counted for. Halfway through the meeting, Charlotte's assistant came in and placed a tablet in front of Charlotte without comment. Charlotte glanced at it, and her expression moved through something Mason couldn't read. She set the tablet face down on the table. The quarterly review of Halverson's operational performance, she said, to the room, shows 11% improvement in processing overhead over the past 18 months. She looked at Mason. The improvement is traced to a set of process recommendations filed in the shared drive in a folder called Process Notes. Mason said nothing. You didn't put your name on it, Charlotte said. It wasn't... He thought about how to say it. It wasn't really about credit. The thing bothered me. I fixed it, and I moved on. Charlotte looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Brandon. Brandon was looking at the table. The person who brought those recommendations to the team meeting, Charlotte said, as his own observation. Who was that? Brandon said, to the table, that was me. The conference room held this information. I didn't know where they came from, Brandon said. They were in the shared drive. There was no name, I assumed. He stopped. I should have looked harder. That's another thing I should have done. Mason said, it doesn't matter. Brandon looked up. It matters. Not to me, Mason said. And then, because that sounded like it might be dismissive rather than what it actually was, he added, I mean, what I built it because the problem was there. Whether my name is on it is a different question. The 11% happened. That's the thing. Charlotte was watching him with the expression she'd had earlier on the sidewalk, the one that was difficult to categorize. Not warm, not cold, but fully attentive in a way that felt oddly respectful. Mr. Walker, she said. Mason, he said, please. Mason. She folded her hands on the table. I'd like to tell you something that I don't say often because I generally believe that what needs to be said in professional context is what's precise and what's useful, and personal observations usually fall into neither category. She paused. I've been in this industry for 9 years. I've run a billion-dollar division, and I've been in the chair for 3 years, and I have met a significant number of people in that time who are excellent at some things and adequate at others, and genuinely distinguished at almost nothing. She looked at him. The thing you just said? About the problem being there and the 11% being the thing. That's the rarest thing. That's the thing that I have spent years trying to build into organizations because you cannot teach it and you cannot mandate it. It either exists in a person or it doesn't. Mason was quiet for a moment. Claire used to say I had a problem with the verb enough, he said. Like, a thing was either fixed or it wasn't. There was no, that's probably good enough. It drove her crazy. Charlotte was very still. Your wife? She said. Yeah. He said it the way he'd learned to say it, even. She passed away. When Ella was less than a year old. The room was quiet. Not awkward. Something else. The specific quiet of people who have just been led into something they didn't expect to be led into and are handling it carefully. I'm sorry, Charlotte said. Thank you, Mason said. She said it the way people say it when they mean it and don't have anything to add to it, which is the best way to say it. And he received it the way he'd learned to receive those words, which was simply and without deflection. There was a pause. Then Charlotte said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly and not strategically. Okay, Mason said. What do you want to happen? She said. Not what you think is fair, not what you think you're owed. What do you actually want? Mason looked at the whiteboard with the faded timeline on it, at the half-erased project notes that nobody had finished cleaning up. He looked at the cardboard box on the floor beside his chair, the cactus regarding the room with its painted expression of permanent, lopsided contentment. He thought about Ella's voice. Daddy. First thing, every time, he thought about the soup he still needed to make. He thought about 3 years of quiet mornings and the 11% and the process notes filed without his name on them and the way the light came through the lobby windows at that particular angle between 9:30 and 10. I want to go home, he said. I want to make my daughter soup because she's sick and she has opinions about canned soup and she's right to have them. And then he stopped, looked at Charlotte. And then I want to think about whether there's something worth building here or whether everyone involved has already learned what this morning had to teach, and we move on separately. He paused. Is that honest enough? Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. That's honest enough. Outside the conference room, through the glass wall, the 14th floor was doing the thing that floors do after extraordinary mornings, returning slowly and imperfectly to the motion of ordinary work. Keyboards. Coffee cups. The particular sound of people trying to resume a thing they'd been doing before the world shifted slightly on its axis. Not the same as before. Not pretending. Just trying to move forward in the way that people do when moving forward is the only option that doesn't require them to stay in place. Brandon Pierce stood at his glass wall with the blinds still all the way down and looked at nothing, and what he felt was not the thing he'd expected to feel after a morning like this one, which he'd have expected to be something defensive or self-protective or bent toward damage control. What he felt, standing there in the privacy of the closed blinds, was something simpler and less manageable than any of that. He felt the specific weight of a small child's fever, of a father's 208 message, of a cardboard box that had only ever held 3 things. He felt it, and he stayed with it, and he didn't try to organize it into something useful yet. Some things needed to be felt before they could be anything else. Mason left the building at 12:47. He came out through the revolving door the same way he'd gone in 3 hours earlier, with the cardboard box under his arm, the cactus regarding the world from inside it. But the going out felt different from the coming in, which had felt different from the original going out, which was how a single Tuesday had accumulated 3 distinct versions of the same door. He thought about that for a second on the sidewalk, in the cold that was the same cold as before, and then he stopped thinking about it because Ella needed soup and he was already late. Richard's convoy was gone. Charlotte's van was still at the curb, which he hadn't expected, and Charlotte was beside it, her coat collar up against the November air, a cup of something in her hand that had clearly been brought out to her by someone because she had the expression of a person who had not requested it and was drinking it anyway. She looked up when he came out. I thought you'd left, Mason said. I have a call at 2, she said. I work from wherever I am when the call happens. She looked at the box. How are you getting home? I drove. I'm parked 2 blocks up. She nodded, drank from the cup. The steam came off it in the cold air and dispersed. Can I ask you something? She said. You've been asking me things all morning, Mason said. It wasn't an objection, just an observation. One more, she said. The process notes. The workflow analysis, the 11%. You've been doing that kind of thing in there for 3 years, quietly, without telling anyone. Yeah. Why? She wasn't challenging it. She sounded genuinely curious in the way of someone who is trying to understand a way of operating that isn't instinctive to them. You had the resources to be doing something significant. You had the foundation, you had the contacts. Why this? Why here? Doing this? Mason looked up the street. At the parked cars and the delivery trucks and the ordinary Tuesdayness of the world, continuing its operation without reference to anything that had happened on the 14th floor this morning. Because it was real, he said. The problem was real. The floor I was working on had a real inefficiency, and fixing it had a real effect. I didn't need it to be bigger than that. He paused. When I was building Viridian, everything was always supposed to be bigger than it was. Every conversation was about scale. Every decision had to justify itself at scale. At some point, it stopped feeling like building something and started feeling like performing the idea of building something. And I didn't know how to say that out loud because everyone around me was so convinced we were doing something extraordinary. Charlotte was quiet. Were you? She said. Doing something extraordinary? Yeah, he said. We were. But extraordinary things can still stop feeling like yours. He looked at the box. Fixing a workflow process that 11 people use every day and watching it actually work better. That's mine. That's just mine. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. The steam from her cup kept rising and dispersing. Okay, she said. Okay? He repeated. I'm not going to try to talk you into a worldview, she said. I just wanted to understand it. She lowered the cup. Go make your daughter soup. He almost smiled. Yeah. He started up the street. He'd gone maybe half a block when she called after him, not loudly. The cold carried it. Mason, he turned. We still need to have the conversation, she said. Not today, but soon. He looked at her across the half block of November sidewalk. She was sitting in her wheelchair outside a building she'd come to inspect and found something entirely other than what she'd expected, holding a cup of something she hadn't asked for. And she looked, he thought about the word and found it was accurate. She looked tired. Not defeated, just the honest tired of someone who carries a significant amount and has stopped pretending she doesn't. I know, he said. I'll call Richard, she said. We'll set something up. He nodded, turned back up the street. He heard her van door behind him, and then the sound of the ramp, and then nothing except the city. The soup took 40 minutes because he made it from scratch, which was the only way Ella would accept it without the specific expression she deployed for canned soups. Not theatrical, just honest, the expression of someone whose standards had been established and were not up for renegotiation. He'd learned to roast the garlic first, a thing Claire had done and that Mason had studied and reverse-engineered over 2 years of trial and error until he had something that tasted close enough to right that Ella had said one evening, around her spoon, Daddy, I think you finally figured out the soup, which was the highest available praise. He'd stopped at the market on the way home, picked up the carrots she liked, the kind with the top still on because she said the other kind looked sad. Picked up bread because soup without bread was, in Ella's taxonomy, incorrect. Stood in the checkout line behind a woman with a very full cart and texted his neighbor Sandra that he was home and would pick Ella up from school himself at 3:15. Thank you. He owed her one. Sandra texted back, You owe me at least 3. What happened this morning? He stared at this for a moment. Long story, he typed back. Tell you later. She sent back a string of question marks that he chose not to address. He made the soup. He cut the bread. He set the couch up the way Ella preferred it, which involved the blanket that had been Claire's being folded a specific way over the arm so that it could be pulled down without the whole thing coming undone. A system Ella had developed at age 5 and enforced with remarkable consistency ever since. He put her water bottle on the coffee table. He found the book they'd been reading together, the one about the girl who discovers a door in her grandmother's house that leads to a place that operates on different rules, and he put it on the couch beside the folded blanket. He was standing at the kitchen counter eating bread while the soup cooled when his phone rang. Not the regular phone, the other one. He looked at it for a moment on the counter. Richard calling, which meant Richard was either in the car on the way back to wherever he'd come from or sitting in a coffee shop somewhere composing himself, which was how Richard did difficult conversations. Never in motion, always with coffee. He picked up. "You left before we finished," Richard said. There was coffee shop noise behind him. Called it. "I told you I needed a couple of days," Mason said. "I know, this isn't that conversation." A pause, a shift of sound. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine." Mason. "I'm fine, Richard. I made soup." A short silence. "For Ella?" "She's sick, yeah." "Right." Another pause. "Charlotte called me from the van. She said the conversation this morning was, she said you handled yourself well." "I was mostly just sitting there," Mason said. "That's what she meant," Richard said, and his voice had something in it that was almost dry, almost fond. The tone of a man who has watched another man be fundamentally himself in difficult circumstances for enough years that it no longer surprises him, but still registers. She also said, and this is Charlotte, so take it for what it is. She said she hadn't expected to be impressed, and that she was. Mason looked at the soup, at the bowl he'd set out, white with a small chip on the rim that he'd been meaning to replace for a year. "She runs the company well," he said. "I don't know everything she's done, but from what I've seen, she runs it well." "She does," Richard said. "She's difficult sometimes, and she's in pain sometimes, and she pushes harder than anyone I've worked with since—" He stopped. Both of them knew the end of that sentence. "Since you." "She's good, Mason. She's really good." Mason was quiet. "What happens to Pierce?" he said. Richard let a small pause go by. "That's partially Charlotte's decision and partially the board's, depending on what process looks like." "Why?" "I don't want him fired," Mason said. The coffee shop noise continued its background existence. "Okay," Richard said, careful. "I mean it. I don't want that to be the outcome of this morning. A man loses his job because he made a bad call, which he made partly because he genuinely believed he was right about something he was wrong about, and partly because the way we built that environment rewarded the behavior that led to the decision." He stopped. "I'm not excusing it. I'm contextualizing it. He should face a consequence, and the consequence should be proportionate, and it should be aimed at changing the behavior, not just removing the problem." Richard was quiet for a moment. "That's a very," he seemed to be choosing the word, "considered position for a man who got fired this morning." "I've had a few hours," Mason said. "Have you thought about what you want from Charlotte's side? Because she's going to want to discuss it, and you know she won't let it go unaddressed." "I know," Mason said. He picked up the soup bowl, set it back down. "Let me get through this afternoon. Let me get through Ella being sick and dinner and putting her to bed. And then I'll think about what I actually want, and I'll call you." "Fair enough," Richard said. "Richard?" "Yeah." "Thank you for coming yourself this morning." A pause. "I wasn't going to send someone else," Richard said, which wasn't exactly an answer, but was the answer, shouting. Ella came home from school at 3:20, delivered by Sandra, who was bursting with curiosity. She was too polite to inflict on a 7-year-old with a fever, and who gave Mason a significant look over Ella's head that communicated clearly that the debt had now risen to 5 and would continue to compound. Ella walked through the door, set down her backpack with the completeness of someone releasing a burden they'd been waiting all day to release, and looked at Mason with eyes that were slightly glassy at the edges in the way of a low-grade fever. Not alarming, just present. "Hi, Daddy," she said. "Hi, Bug," he said. "How was school?" "Fine, except my head hurt a little after lunch." She said it with the pragmatism of someone who has assessed the situation and found it manageable but worth reporting. "Did you make soup?" "I made soup." She looked at the kitchen, sniffed. "The real kind?" "The real kind." Something settled in her face that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite happiness, more like the satisfaction of someone whose expectations have been met by someone they trusted to meet them. She went to the couch, found the blanket folded correctly over the arm, pulled it down, arranged herself under it with the focused efficiency of a child who knows how to be sick and be comfortable simultaneously, and held out her hand for the bowl without looking away from the middle distance where she was deciding something about the afternoon. "Can we read the book?" she said. "Yeah," he said, "after you eat. She ate with the slow steadiness of someone conserving energy, and he sat beside her on the couch, and neither of them talked much, which was one of the things he'd discovered about Ella early on, that she had the same tolerance for silence that he did, that she didn't need the space filled, that she could sit beside him in a quiet room and feel neither uncomfortable nor disconnected, which was a quality he hadn't known to hope for, and which had turned out to be one of the specific gifts of being her father. After the soup, she handed him the bowl and pulled the blanket up to her chin and said, "Daddy?" "Yeah." "Did something happen today?" He looked at her. She was looking at him with the particular attention she brought to important questions, head slightly tilted, her mother's eyes asking something her mother's child had no business already knowing how to ask. "Yeah," he said. "A few things." "Good things or bad things?" He thought about it honestly. "Both," he said. "Some things that started bad ended up being something different. I'm not sure what yet." She considered this. Sandra looked like she had a lot of questions. "She did," he said. "I'll answer them later." Ella seemed satisfied with this. She resettled herself against the couch cushions and held out a hand toward the book on the cushion beside him. Without saying anything else, and he picked it up and found their page and started reading. And within 20 minutes, she was asleep against his shoulder with her mouth slightly open in the way she'd slept since she was an infant. And he kept reading for a while after that because it was quiet and the soup had been good, and the afternoon light had gone the gray, early dark November gray that he'd come to associate with being home. He thought about the morning. He let himself think about it fully, for the first time, now that she was asleep and the soup was done, and there was no immediate next thing to be handled. He thought about Brandon Pierce's face in the conference room. The specific texture of Brandon's honesty once the posturing was gone, which had surprised him. Not that Brandon had been honest eventually, but that the honesty, when it came, hadn't had the quality of strategy. It had just been a man looking at something he'd done and not liking what he saw. Mason had known enough people in enough rooms to know the difference, and the difference mattered. He thought about what he'd said to Richard on the phone. "I don't want him fired." He'd meant it when he said it, and he still meant it now, sitting in the November quiet with his daughter asleep on his shoulder. And he examined the meaning of it carefully, the way you examine a thing you believe to make sure you believe it for the reasons you think you do, rather than some other reason wearing the same clothes. It wasn't magnanimity. He was clear on that. It wasn't the performance of being a bigger person. It wasn't strategy, though he could see how it might look like strategy. It was something more specific than any of those things. And it took him a while in the quiet to find the word for it. It was accuracy. What Brandon Pierce deserved was an accurate consequence, one that named what happened and responded to what happened without inflating it into something it wasn't. Firing him would be an inflated consequence. It would make the story about Brandon the villain rather than Brandon the man who built a set of habits that a particular environment had never challenged, and which had led, on a particular Tuesday morning, to a decision that hurt someone. Firing him cleaned the building of the specific person without doing anything about the environment that made the decision possible, and Mason had spent too many years understanding organizational systems to find that satisfying. He thought about Charlotte. He thought about her on the sidewalk with the cup of something she hadn't asked for, saying, "Go make your daughter soup," with the directness of someone who understood exactly what the right thing was without needing to make it complicated. He thought about her in the conference room asking, "What do you actually want?" and meaning it, being genuinely willing to receive whatever the answer was without pre-organizing her response. He thought about the accident she'd had, the broad outlines he knew without the details he didn't, and how she moved through the world with the absence of performance around her disability that he recognized as something that cost something. Not the thing itself, but the dailiness of it, the fact of doing it every Tuesday the way he did the tired every morning, privately, before Ella came downstairs. He thought they probably understood something similar about carrying something. He wasn't sure if that was a useful thing to think or just a true thing. Ella shifted in her sleep, made a small sound. He stayed still so she wouldn't wake, and she settled back, and her breathing went slow again. 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon, Mason drove to the Viridian building across town. He'd been there before, in another life. Had in fact sat in rooms on the upper floors during the early years, had argued about product roadmaps and hiring decisions, and the precise wording of public statements in a conference room on the 22nd floor that probably had different furniture now. He hadn't been back since. He parked in the visitor lot and went in through the main entrance and gave his name at the desk, which was a strange experience. The security guard typed his name into the system, and Mason watched the guard's expression do something brief and controlled when the system returned. Whatever it returned, and the guard said, "Mr. Walker, Ms. Hayes is expecting you, 42nd floor," with a slightly different quality of attention than the situation had started with, and Mason said, "Thank you," and took his visitor badge and went to the elevator. The 42nd floor had a view of the city that Mason had forgotten. He stood at the elevator doors for a second and looked at it. The grid of streets and the variable heights of buildings and the particular color of the sky at 3 in the afternoon in November, which was a specific shade of nothing that he'd never found adequate language for. And then Charlotte's assistant appeared and led him to a meeting room. Charlotte was already there. Richard was not, which meant this conversation was going to be a different kind of conversation than the one earlier in the week. And Mason had known that from the way Charlotte had framed the call when she'd set it up. Just us, and whoever you want to bring, but I'm thinking just us. He hadn't brought anyone. She had coffee on the table and a second cup ready, which he took without discussion, and they sat across from each other at a table that was much larger than the two of them needed, which was maybe intentional, or maybe just the way conference rooms worked when you ran the kind of company that needed large conference rooms. "How's your daughter?" Charlotte said. "Better," he said. "She went back to school Wednesday. She told her teacher she'd been ill, and her teacher said, 'I heard you had a cold,' and Ella said I had a fever, which is different, and apparently held her ground on this point for several minutes." Charlotte looked like she was deciding whether to smile. She decided to. It was small, but it was real. "She sounds exhausting," she said. "She's the best thing in my life," Mason said. "So yeah." Charlotte nodded. Set her coffee down. The smile was gone, not replaced by anything cold, just replaced by focus. "I want to talk about Halverson," she said, "and I want to talk about what comes next. But before either of those things," she stopped, looked at him directly. "I want to say something that I should have said Tuesday and didn't, and I want to say it clearly and then move on." "Okay," Mason said. "I've been in that building for quarterly inspections for 3 years," she said. "Halverson has been in the portfolio for 3 years. I've walked that floor. I sat in a meeting on the 14th floor 8 months ago where someone presented a process improvement analysis that I thought was sharp and asked about the source and was told it came from an internal review." Mason was quiet. "I took it at face value," she said. "I didn't dig. I noted in my review that Halverson had strong internal analytical capacity, and I moved on to the next item." She paused. "I walked past your desk. I sat in the same room as you at least twice, and I looked at the metrics and not the people. And I want to acknowledge that as a failure, not a dramatic one, not an unusual one, but a failure." The room was quiet in the particular way of rooms where something true has just been said. Mason looked at his coffee cup. He was thinking about how to answer this, whether to accept it or to push back on it, and then he realized he was thinking about it the wrong way. The question wasn't what the strategic or gracious or correct response was. The question was what he actually thought. "The thing is," he said slowly, "you're not wrong, but I also made it hard on purpose. I mean, I designed the anonymity. I built it carefully. So when you say you didn't see me, part of that is the system, and part of it is that I specifically set up the conditions for not being seen." He looked at her. "I'm not letting you completely off the hook, but I'm also saying you were working with what I gave you, and I gave you very little." Charlotte looked at him for a moment. "That's a very—" She seemed to be reaching for the right word. "Richard said considered," Mason said, earlier in the week. "I was going to say fair," she said, "but yes, considered too." She picked up her coffee again. "Okay, thank you for that." "Thank you for saying the other thing," he said. "You didn't have to." "I don't do things I don't have to do," she said simply. "I said it because it was accurate, and because I think accuracy matters more than comfort in most conversations." He thought, yes, that was exactly right. I thought it and didn't say it because some agreements are better held than expressed. They sat with that for a moment. "Halverson," Charlotte said. "Halverson," he said. She set her coffee down. "The Halverson situation is practically speaking straightforward. You were wrongfully terminated. The termination was actioned without due process under the company's own HR framework, and the company has both an ethical and a legal obligation to address it. Richard's team has already begun that process. She looked at him. But that's the paperwork version. What I'm asking is the other version. Whether I want to go back, Mason said. Do you? He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he'd been thinking about anything since Tuesday. He thought about the desk by the window, about Priya and Garrett and Dana, about the workflow problem that had bothered him for a year and that he'd fixed in his own time because the bothering of it didn't care whether it was his job to fix it. About the quiet of that floor in the early morning when he came in before most people and the city was still doing its gray preliminary version of the day. I think the question isn't whether I go back, he said. I think the question is whether going back is the right shape for what I'm thinking about. Charlotte tilted her head slightly. What are you thinking about? He looked at the window, at the city in its November colors. The environment on that floor didn't cause Tuesday, he said. Brandon Pierce caused Tuesday. But the environment let it develop over years without catching it. The environment doesn't have systems for seeing the people inside it. Not really seeing them, not the way that would have caught someone like me being invisible, or caught someone like Brandon operating with unchecked authority, or caught the 6 other people on that floor who are doing versions of what I did, quietly, without recognition, because the recognition systems in that building are pointed at the wrong things. He looked back at Charlotte. I think about that. I think about what a workplace looks like if you build it the other way around. If you start with the question of what the people inside it need in order to do their best work, rather than starting with the metrics and then asking the people to fit themselves to the metrics. Charlotte was very still. That's not a small idea, she said. No, he said. That's also not a Halverson scale idea, she said. She stopped. That's a conversation about the whole portfolio. That's a conversation about how we build every organization we touch. I know, Mason said. The room was quiet. Outside, the city continued its indifferent November operation. Traffic and weather and ordinary Tuesday logistics, except it was Friday now, and the week had been anything but ordinary. Brandon Pierce, Charlotte said. You told Richard you don't want him fired. I don't, Mason said. I want him to face something real and something proportionate. I want the consequence to change the behavior rather than just remove the problem. Charlotte looked at him steadily. What would that look like to you? I don't know exactly, he said. Formal process, real review, a demotion if the review supports it, supervised leadership for a period, something that names what happened and responds to it while leaving room for the person to change. He paused. He was honest in that conference room. I don't know if honesty is a character trait or if it was a situational response to a situation where dishonesty wasn't going to work, and I don't think he knows either. But it was real, and I think real things should be met with real things. Charlotte was quiet for a long time, long enough that he wondered if he'd misjudged the room. Then she said, You know that most people in your position would want something different. Yeah, he said. Most people in your position, with your resources, with what this morning cost you publicly, with everything, would want to see something that looked more like justice. This is what justice looks like to me, Mason said. I'm not interested in the version of justice that's just revenge wearing the right clothes. Charlotte looked at him. Something moved across her face. Brief, complicated, gone before he could name it, though he thought it might have been related to the same thing he'd noticed on the sidewalk, that recognition from personal experience rather than abstract understanding. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. I'll run the Brandon Pierce process the way you've described, she said. Not because you asked me to, because it's the right way to run it, and I should have had these systems in place before Tuesday happened. She paused. And because I want to talk to you about the larger conversation, the one about building it the other way around. He looked at her. You said you'd think about what you wanted, she said. Have you thought about it? He had. He'd thought about it Wednesday night after Ella was in bed, and Thursday morning over coffee and on the drive over here this afternoon, and somewhere in all that thinking, the shape of it had become clearer than he'd expected it to become. Yeah, he said. I've thought about it. And? He set his coffee cup down. Outside the window, the city was doing its ordinary thing, indifferent and continuous and full of people carrying invisible weights from one end of their day to the other. I think, Mason said, that we should talk about what comes next. And for the first time since Tuesday morning, The thing he felt sitting in that room was not the weight of the tired, not the management of grief, not the daily discipline of keeping Ella from seeing what he carried. What he felt, sitting across from Charlotte Hayes at a table too large for two people in a room 42 floors above a city going about its business, was something that had been absent for long enough that he almost didn't recognize it. It felt like the beginning of something. He wasn't sure yet what it was. He wasn't going to pretend he was sure. But it was there, and it was real, and for now that was enough. The conversation that Friday afternoon went 3 hours longer than either of them had planned. Charlotte's 2 o'clock call got pushed, then her 3:30. Her assistant came in at 4 with a look that communicated professional concern without overstepping, and Charlotte said reschedule the Meridian call to Monday, without looking away from the whiteboard where she and Mason had been working through something that had started as a general idea and was becoming, in the specific way that serious ideas become things, an actual structure. Mason had borrowed a marker from the whiteboard tray and was writing in the way he thought, which was non-linearly, circles and connecting lines and occasional words that stood in for larger concepts they'd already agreed on, a shorthand that had developed over the 3 hours with the organic efficiency of two people who think at similar speeds. Charlotte had been adding to it from her side of the table, reaching forward to circle things, or cross them out, and at some point they'd both stopped being polite about it and started just building the thing, which was how you knew a conversation had become real. The thing they were building was not a policy. It was not a program. Those words had come up and both of them had pushed back on them instinctively, which was the first indication that they were thinking about it the same way. What they were building was closer to a philosophy with teeth, a set of operating principles for every organization in the Viridian portfolio, beginning with Halverson, that started from a different question than the one those organizations currently started from. Most workplaces, Mason had said at some point in the second hour, start from the question of what the organization needs from the people inside it. Output, performance, measurable contribution. Those things weren't wrong in themselves. You couldn't run anything without them. But when they became the primary architecture, everything else got built around them as accommodation rather than foundation. Flexible scheduling was an accommodation. Parental support was an accommodation. Accessibility was, in most of the buildings Mason had been in, an accommodation, something retrofitted into a structure that had been built without it in mind, which was why it so often had the quality of an afterthought, present but ungraceful. Charlotte had been quiet during this part, not the quiet of someone waiting to respond, the quiet of someone who was recognizing something from the inside of it rather than the outside. The ramp at a Halverson comes out next to the freight entrance, she said. Yeah, Mason said. The visitor entrance has 3 steps. Yeah. She looked at the whiteboard, at what they'd been building. That's the same thing, she said. Isn't it? It's the same problem wearing a different face. It's the same problem, he said. She picked up her own marker, drew a line on the whiteboard from the circle that said, accommodate to a new circle she wrote design for, and then looked at it and said, that's where we start. Every building, every schedule, every system. We start by asking who we're designing for, and we make the answer everyone, not the median employee with special cases handled separately. Mason looked at the whiteboard. That's going to cost money, he said. Yes, she said. The board will want projections on return. I'll handle the board, she said, with the simplicity of someone who has been handling the board for 3 years and has calibrated exactly how much of her confidence to spend on any given battle. He believed her. The formal announcement came 6 weeks later, which was fast by the standards of large organizational change, and not fast enough by the standards of the people it would affect, which is always the tension with these things. Mason had expected more friction from the Halverson board, had prepared for it, had run the numbers in his head, had thought through the counterarguments with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to workflow problems. The friction existed but was less than expected, partly because Charlotte presented the initiative with the kind of specificity that makes it harder to argue against a feeling than against a plan, and partly because Richard had done the behind-the-scenes work that he always did, the work that didn't appear in meeting minutes but was what made meetings productive. The initiative had a name eventually, though Mason had been resistant to the naming of it for longer than Charlotte thought was practical. He'd wanted it to just be the way things worked, rather than a branded thing with a logo, and Charlotte had understood his reasoning and overruled it anyway because, as she'd said, unnamed things don't travel, and this needs to travel. They called it the Foundation Standard, which was plain enough that Mason had accepted it, and specific enough that it meant something. At Halverson, the changes were visible within the first month and meaningful within the first quarter. Accessible infrastructure was redesigned, not patched, but rebuilt, starting with the visitor entrance, the ramp placement, the elevator sizing, the width of workspace corridors. Flexible scheduling became structural rather than case by case, which meant it stopped requiring people to justify their lives to their managers before they could arrange their working hours around those lives. A childcare support fund was established that covered emergency gaps, sick kids, school closures, the specific category of crisis that hit single parents at random and which had been, previously, entirely their problem to solve. Mason funded the scholarships himself, personally, without announcement. They went to employees' children, $100 a month toward any educational program, renewable annually, no application required beyond enrollment verification. Small money by some measures. By other measures, the specific measure of a parent doing the math at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock. It was not small at all. Dana found out about the scholarships 3 months in, through a conversation with someone in HR who mentioned them in passing, and she sat at her desk for a few minutes after that conversation doing nothing in particular. Then she opened a blank document and started writing something she'd been meaning to write for a while, which was an email to Mason that she hadn't known how to begin. She wrote it now. It wasn't long. It said, "I should have asked more 3 years ago. I'm glad I know now. Thank you for what you've built here, and for the other thing you built that the rest of us get to work inside of now. Dana." Mason read it on a Tuesday morning. He wrote back, "You were a good colleague. That counted, even when I didn't say so." Brandon Pierce did not get fired. This disappointed some people who felt the morning's drama required a more conclusive exit for its antagonist, and Mason understood that feeling without sharing it. The formal review process took 4 weeks and produced a demotion from regional manager to senior analyst, a title reduction that carried a salary reduction and a change in reporting structure, combined with a 6-month supervised period and a mandatory leadership development program that Charlotte had selected with the specific intention of it being challenging rather than performative. Brandon accepted all of it without negotiation. He did something else, too, which nobody had asked him to do, and which therefore meant more than anything that had been required of him. 3 weeks after the review concluded, he asked to speak at the all-hands meeting that Charlotte had scheduled to introduce the foundation standard to the full Halverson staff. Charlotte had looked at the request for a long moment before approving it, and she'd told Mason about it the evening before, on the phone, with the tone of someone who wasn't sure how it was going to land. "What do you think he'll say?" she asked. "I don't know," Mason said, "but I think he means it, whatever it is." He was right. Brandon stood in front of the assembled Halverson staff, 212 people, in the main event space on the 6th floor, the kind of room that felt too large and too formal for the words he was about to use. And he didn't use notes. He stood there without notes and said that he had built his management career on a set of assumptions about what strong leadership looked like, and that those assumptions had been wrong, and that he had not known they were wrong because nobody had ever challenged them, including himself. He said he had fired a man for being a father, and that he had done it using the language of performance management, and that the language had made it feel like the right thing, and that the language was wrong, and the decision was wrong, and the feeling had been an artifact of the language rather than of actual judgment. He said, "I want to be the kind of leader I wasn't. I don't know if I'll get there, but I want to be, and I think wanting it honestly is the only place it starts." The room was quiet after he stopped. Then someone started clapping, slowly at first, and it built. And Brandon Pierce stood at the front of the room looking like a man who had not expected this and was not sure he deserved it, and was also, despite both of those things, genuinely moved, and that combination of uncertainty and feeling was the most honest thing Mason had ever seen him produce. Mason was in the back of the room. He clapped too. The annual company gathering happened in late spring, 8 months after the Tuesday that had started everything. Charlotte had wanted to do it at a hotel ballroom, and Mason had lobbied for something less formal, and they'd compromised on the rooftop event space of the Halverson building itself, which nobody had ever used for an event because it required navigating logistics that had previously seemed prohibitive, and now, with the revised building infrastructure, were simply logistics. The evening was mild. Late May in the city had that particular quality of the year finding its footing after months of gray, the air doing something it hadn't done since October, and the rooftop had a view that the people who worked in the building had never seen from this angle because they'd never been up here in any context that wasn't maintenance. 231 people. Halverson had grown, not explosively, but steadily, in the way that organizations grow when the people inside them stop spending energy on surviving the environment and redirect it toward the work. New hires who had come because the foundation standard had started appearing in the right places, in the conversations that happened between people who were looking for somewhere to work that wasn't organized against them. Mason arrived late, which was consistent with his personality and which nobody who knew him was surprised by. He came off the elevator with Ella beside him, her hand in his, wearing a dress she had selected herself and shoes that she had argued for on the grounds that they were comfortable, and also, she'd said with 8-year-old certainty, extremely presentable. And Mason had looked at the shoes and at Ella and decided this was not a battle that needed to happen. Ella looked at the rooftop and at the people and at the lights that someone had strung along the perimeter, which were small and warm and reflected off the city's evening glass, and she said, "Daddy, this is nice." "Yeah," he said. "Did you build this?" He looked at her. "The party or the company?" She thought about this seriously. "Both," she said. "Sort of," he said. "A lot of people built it." She seemed to find this answer satisfactory in the way she found most honest answers satisfactory, which was one of the things about her that was entirely and specifically her own. She spotted the food table and made a decision about her immediate priorities, and he let go of her hand and watched her cross the rooftop with the directed purpose of someone who knows what they want and doesn't waste time getting there. He stood at the edge of the gathering for a moment, the way he stood at most gatherings, near the perimeter, with enough distance to see the whole of it. He was not a different person than he'd been 8 months ago. That was the thing people sometimes got wrong about the kind of change that follows an extraordinary event. They expected transformation, a before and after, a person who had been rebuilt by what happened to them. He was the same man who had walked out of this building on a Tuesday morning with a cardboard box containing a photograph and a cactus. He still got tired in the same way. He still missed Claire at unpredictable moments, in the specific way of a loss that doesn't diminish so much as become familiar, something you learn to carry rather than something that gets lighter. He was just carrying it somewhere different now. "You're doing the perimeter thing," said Charlotte from beside him. He hadn't heard her approach, which was something about how his attention had been elsewhere, because Charlotte Hayes moving across a crowded room was not something you failed to notice if you were paying attention. She'd come up on his left side, her wheelchair quiet on the rooftop surface, and she had a glass of something in one hand and the expression of someone who had been navigating the evening's social obligations for the past hour and was giving herself a break. "I always do the perimeter thing," he said. "I know," she said. "I've watched you at 4 events now. You come in, you find the edge, you look at everything from outside it." She looked at the gathered crowd. "I do it too, actually. I just can't always stand at the literal perimeter without it becoming a thing, so I have to be more internal about it." He looked at her. "Does it bother you? People making it a thing?" "It used to," she said simply. "Now it mostly just tires me, which is its own improvement." She sipped her drink. "Ella is eating everything on the food table." "She had a small lunch," Mason said. "She was saving room." "She told me that herself, actually. She came over and introduced herself and explained her strategy for the buffet with a level of tactical detail I found impressive." Mason looked across the rooftop to where Ella was in conversation with Dana, which he hadn't expected but which made a specific kind of sense. Dana, who had asked more questions in the past 8 months than in the 3 years before. Dana, who had become one of the people on the Halverson floor who the foundation standard had most visibly uncompressed, who had started arriving with an ease she hadn't previously carried. "She's a good kid," he said. "She's a remarkable kid," Charlotte said. "She told me she wants to be an engineer when she grows up, or a chef. She said, and I'm quoting here, that she hasn't decided which one feeds more people." Something happened in Mason's chest that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite sorrow and was entirely too large to name adequately. He just looked at his daughter across the rooftop and felt it. "That's Claire," he said. "That's completely Claire." Charlotte was quiet beside him. "Tell me about her," she said after a moment, "if you want to." He looked at her. She was looking at the city, not at him, which he understood as an offering. The question posed without the pressure of direct eye contact, with the door open but no one standing in it. He thought about how he answered this question normally, the even delivery, the smooth managed version of it, the Claire who existed in the sentences he'd learned to produce. And then he thought about how he was tired of that version. Not because it was dishonest, it wasn't, but because it was incomplete, and incompleteness had its own cost. She was difficult, he said, in the best possible way. She had opinions about everything, and she expressed them continuously, and she was wrong sometimes, and she knew when she was wrong, and she'd just pivot completely, no ego about it, just, okay, I was wrong, next thing. I've never met anyone else who could do that. He paused. She would have been terrible at corporate environments. She would have redesigned every meeting she was in within 15 minutes and told everyone the redesign was an improvement, and she would have been right. Charlotte made a sound that might have been a laugh, small and real. She sounds like someone I would have liked, she said. Most people did, Mason said. She was the kind of person that other people wanted to be around, and she was always slightly baffled by this, like she couldn't understand why the wanting to be around wasn't just mutual, just obvious. He stopped. When she died, I kept thinking there had to be someone to blame. For a long time, I needed there to be someone to blame, because the alternative was that it just happened, and things that just happen without cause or fault or agency, those are harder to carry than things with someone to blame. Did you find someone? Charlotte said. No, he said. There wasn't anyone. There was a disease and an outcome and a set of probabilities that landed badly, and that's the whole story. No villain, no mistake. Just the way some things go. He let out a slow breath. Learning to carry that was the work of years. I'm still working on it. Yeah, Charlotte said quietly. I know something about carrying things with no one to blame. He looked at her. She was still watching the city, and her expression was the one he'd come to recognize over the past 8 months. Not closed, not performing openness, just present with something. The honest face. The accident? He said. There was someone to blame, technically, she said. A driver who ran a red light at 50 miles an hour. He survived. I didn't survive the same way. She paused. I spent a year being angry at him, and it was correct anger. It was accurate anger. He did a reckless thing, and I paid for it. But at some point, I had to figure out what to do with the anger once I'd been angry long enough, because you can't build anything out of it. Anger is fuel, not material. You can use it to get somewhere, but you can't build the destination out of it. Mason thought about this. What did you build the destination out of? He said. She turned to look at him, direct as always. Work, she said, and honesty, and the specific stubbornness of wanting to prove to myself that I was still the person I was before, which I was and also wasn't, which is probably the most accurate thing I can say about who I am now. She looked back at the crowd. And people, eventually. The right ones. He nodded. They stood in the kind of silence that had become comfortable between them over 8 months of building something together. Meetings and calls, and the occasional argument about priorities that resolved into better decisions than either of them would have reached alone. It was the silence of two people who have established enough of a working understanding that quiet doesn't require filling. I want to ask you something, Mason said. You've been asking me things for 8 months, Charlotte said, with the flat echo of his own line back at him, and the corners of her mouth did something. One more, he said. The board meets next month to review the foundation standard expansion, rolling it out across the other portfolio companies. You're going to present. Yes, she said. Do you need me there? She looked at him. No, she said. I can handle the board. I know you can, he said. That's not the question. The question is whether you want me there. A pause. Yes, she said. I want you there. He nodded. Then I'll be there. She looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically, not in the cinematic way of someone experiencing a revelation. Just a small shift, the kind that happens when a thing that has been uncertain resolves into something clearer, and you feel the resolution before you have words for it. Okay, she said. Across the rooftop, Ella had finished her strategic buffet operation and was now apparently telling Dana something at length, with the hand gestures she used when the thing she was explaining was important, which was most things. Dana was listening with the expression of someone who had been genuinely surprised by a 7-year-old and was reordering their expectations accordingly. Mason watched his daughter and thought about something he'd been thinking about in various ways since the Tuesday that had started all of this, about visibility and what it cost to be invisible, and what it cost to be seen, and whether there was a version of a life where neither cost had to be as high as he'd made it. He had built the invisibility for good reasons. He stood by the reasons. He would not walk back the 3 years at Halverson, or the choice to give Ella a childhood without the weight of his net worth shaping her understanding of the world. Those were right choices, made from the right place, and he was not in the habit of revising right choices retroactively just because they'd had a complicated Tuesday. But there had been a cost. He saw it now, more clearly than he'd let himself see it while he was inside it. The cost was not the missed opportunities, not the professional invisibility, not even the 11% whose origin had been misattributed for 8 months. The cost was smaller and more personal than any of that. The cost was what it takes out of you, daily, to walk through your own life like a person who has decided not to be there fully, even when the decision is right, even when you're doing it for someone you love. There is something that it asks of you, and it asks it every day, and eventually you feel the asking even if you don't name it. He had not been fully somewhere in a long time. He was working on it. What? Richard found him near the end of the evening, when the crowd had thinned and the lights were doing their quiet thing against the darkened city. Richard Holt, at 64, was a man who had stopped needing to be perceived in any particular way, which gave him a quality of ease that Mason had always respected, and which made conversations with him simple in the way that conversations with people who aren't managing their image are simple. He came up beside Mason with a drink he'd been carrying for an hour and probably hadn't touched. "Good night," Richard said. "Yeah," Mason said. "Charlotte presented the Phase 2 numbers to me this afternoon before the event. The portfolio projections, the operational modeling." He paused. "She's good, Mason. She is genuinely, seriously good." "I know," Mason said. "The board is going to approve it," Richard said. "Not without objections, but they'll approve it. The Halverson metrics are too strong to argue with." Mason nodded. "I want to ask you something," Richard said, "and I want you to know I'm asking as a friend and not as the executive chairman." "Okay," Mason said. "Are you happy?" The question sat between them in the mild May air. Mason looked at it honestly, which was the only way he'd been looking at questions since November. It was not a simple question. Happiness was not a state he thought about in simple terms, had not since the Thursday in March 7 years ago, when the word had reorganized itself around a new reality. What he had most days was not happiness in the uncomplicated sense. What he had was something more like rightness, the feeling of being in the right place, doing the right thing, for the right reasons, with enough of himself present to know it. He had that more than he'd had it in years. "Yeah," he said. "I think so. More than I've been." Richard nodded. "Good," he said, and meant it the way he meant simple things, completely and without embellishment. Ella appeared at Mason's elbow at that moment, slightly sticky from the dessert portion of her buffet strategy, and she looked up at Richard with the frank appraisal she applied to unfamiliar adults. "Are you Daddy's friend?" she said. Richard looked down at her. "I've known your father since before you were born," he said. "That's a long time," Ella said. "It is." She seemed to weigh this. "Do you think he's a good person?" she said, with the directness of someone who has decided that the most efficient path to information is the most direct one. Richard looked at Mason. Mason looked at the city, which was doing its steady, indifferent thing, lit and continuous and entirely unbothered by the question. "I think he's one of the best people I know," Richard said. "Why do you ask?" Ella considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "I just like knowing what other people think," she said. "It helps me check my information." Richard looked like he was deciding whether to laugh. He decided to. "Well," he said, "I hope the information checks out." "It does," Ella said, with complete confidence. And then she took Mason's hand in the way she still did sometimes, sudden and without preamble, because she wanted to, and she was 8 and wanting to was enough reason. Mason held on. He thought about Tuesday mornings, about cardboard boxes and the specific weight of carrying your whole life in a medium-sized box and walking out a door and sitting in November air and thinking about soup. I thought about the lobby light between 9:30 and 10, the way it fell across the floor at that particular angle, and reminded him of the kitchen window at home. He thought about a man who had built something extraordinary and then walked away from it, not because he'd failed, but because something had mattered more, and about the cost of that, and about whether the cost was worth it, and about the fact that there was no clean answer to that question, and there never would be. He thought about Claire saying you have a problem with the verb enough. He thought about Ella at the food table explaining her tactical approach to a woman who had been surprised and charmed by it. He thought about Charlotte at the perimeter with her honest face, saying anger is fuel, not material. He thought about Brandon Pierce at the front of a room without notes, saying, I want to be the kind of leader I wasn't, and the room clapping slowly and then all at once. He thought about all the invisible people in all the buildings he had walked through, the ones doing quiet work without credit, the ones leaving early for the right reasons and being penalized for it, the ones whose visible lives were the small fraction of the total weight they carried. He thought about the fact that the world was full of people in cardboard box moments, walking out of doors, and that most of them didn't have what he had waiting on the other side of the door, and that this was the thing that actually mattered, more than any particular outcome on any particular Tuesday. You cannot do much about the doors. People will lose jobs and face humiliation and have their invisible weights made visible at the worst possible moment. And some of them will have extraordinary Tuesday mornings, and most of them will just have Tuesdays. And that's the shape of it. What you can do. What he had understood, slowly and imperfectly over 8 months of building something new out of something broken, is what you build on the other side. What kind of rooms you make. What the rooms ask of the people inside them, and what the rooms give back. You cannot make the world see what it has decided not to see. You can build places where the scene is built into the structure, where the question, who are we designing for, has to be answered every time, and the answer has to be everyone, and someone has to check. It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. 231 people on a rooftop in late May was not the world, and the foundation standard in the Viridian portfolio was not a solution to anything at scale. He was clear-eyed about that. He had always been clear-eyed about what things were and what they weren't, which was sometimes a problem and sometimes the only thing that kept a person honest. But it was real. And the 11% was real. And Ella's hand in his was real, warm and slightly sticky and entirely present. He looked down at her. She was looking at the city, at the lights and the distances and the specific nighttime quality of a view she'd never had before. "Daddy," she said. "Yeah, Bug. I like it up here." "Yeah," he said. "Me too." She leaned against his arm the way she did, the familiar weight of her, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood at the perimeter of the rooftop and looked out at everything. All the lit-up ordinary distance of a city going about its business. And Mason Walker held on to his daughter and stood in his own life completely, without managing it or hiding it or organizing it into something more presentable than it was, and felt, for the length of that moment, exactly where he was supposed to be. Which was not the same as everything being fixed. It wasn't. There was still the tired, and there was still the March anniversary every year that arrived like weather, and there were still mornings when Ella's eyes looked like Claire's eyes, and the resemblance cost him something that had no adequate name. There was still work to do that was hard, and people to navigate who were complicated, and a board meeting next month, and 100 decisions that would be the wrong call before they turned out to be the right one. There was still all of that. But there was also this, a rooftop in May, and his daughter's weight against his arm, and a city spread out like an argument for continuing, lit and various and full of invisible people doing invisible work that mattered whether or not anyone was watching. He had spent years choosing not to be seen. He was done with that now. Not because Tuesday had taught him some lesson about the cost of hiding, though it had, and the lesson was real. But because Ella was 8 and she was checking her information, and the information she was gathering about her father was information she would carry for the rest of her life, and he wanted it to be accurate. He wanted her to know who he was, all of it, the tired and the grief and the 11% and the soup and the quiet work filed without his name on it, and the 3 years of the lobby light at 9:30, and the cactus with the painted face that was currently on his desk in the new office, because he'd kept it, obviously, because some things you keep. He wanted her to know the man who had walked out a door with a cardboard box and sat in the November cold thinking about soup, because that man was also him, was maybe the truest version of him, the one that existed underneath all the extraordinary and the invisible and the $12 billion that meant nothing on a Thursday in March, and meant nothing on a Tuesday morning when a small, rough voice said "Daddy" on the phone before anything else. That man was who he was. And that man, it turned out, was enough.